Frank Brennan's coffee mug slipped from his arthritic fingers, shattering against the frozen dock as he stared at the dark shape trapped in Clearwater Lake's deadly ice. The massive German Shepherd wasn't moving, except for one desperate paw clawing weakly at the jagged edge where the thin November ice had given way. This wasn't just another stray dog. Dr. Patricia Williams would later gasp when she saw the faded military tattoo hidden beneath the matted fur. K9247AFG. Betty Morrison's hands trembled as she watched Frank wade into the killing cold, whispering prayers her late husband used to say. The dog's eyes, intelligent, trusting, locked onto Frank's with an intensity that made the old postal worker's chest seize with recognition. "Easy, boy, I've got you." Frank had buried his wife Margaret 18 months ago, buried his relationship with his son Michael 3 years before that, and buried his will to live somewhere in between. But something about those drowning eyes demanded he choose, save a life or watch another soul slip away on his watch. What Frank couldn't know was that pulling this half-dead dog from the ice would cost him his house, his savings, and nearly his sanity. How could he predict that this single act of mercy would either destroy what little he had left or give him everything he'd lost? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Brennan had been counting down to nothing for 18 months. At 68, the retired postal worker's days had shrunk to a predictable rhythm of instant coffee, morning news, and the kind of silence that settles into a house like dust after someone dies. His modest ranch home on Clearwater Lake had once echoed with Margaret's laughter, her off-key humming while she cooked Sunday dinners that drew their son Michael and grandson Tommy like magnets. Now the rooms felt too big, the walls too quiet, and Frank too small to fill the spaces where love used to live. The lake had been their sanctuary. 43 years of marriage had played out on its shores, first dates in borrowed rowboats, teaching Michael to fish from the old wooden dock, watching Margaret feed ducks while she recovered from her final round of chemotherapy. After the funeral, Frank had kept coming to the water's edge each morning, not because it brought him peace, but because it was the only place where missing her felt like a conversation instead of an echo. His pension of $2,400 a month covered the basics: property taxes, utilities, groceries that Margaret would have called bachelor food, frozen dinners eaten standing over the kitchen sink, coffee that stayed warm in the pot until bedtime. The savings account held $8,500. Money they'd been setting aside for the Alaska cruise Margaret had circled in travel brochures for years. "To see the glaciers before they're all gone," she'd say, never knowing she'd be gone first. The estrangement from Michael had calcified slowly, like arthritis in Frank's hands, painful but so gradual he'd barely noticed until the damage was done. It started with missed birthdays, arguments about Margaret's care, and harsh words spoken in hospital waiting rooms when exhaustion and grief had stripped away all their patience. When Michael's marriage fell apart 3 years ago, he'd asked Frank to take 12-year-old Tommy for the summer. Frank had said no. He was tired, he'd explained. Margaret was sick. The timing wasn't right. Michael had nodded, gathered his son, and stopped calling. Tommy, who used to beg for stories about Frank's mail route adventures, had stopped asking to visit Grandpa's lake house. Now Frank's only regular human contact came from Betty Morrison, his neighbor of 15 years, who'd lost her own husband, Paul, to a heart attack the winter before Margaret's diagnosis. Betty was everything Margaret had been: kind, stubborn, quick to laugh, and Frank couldn't look at her without feeling like he was betraying his wife's memory by noticing. She brought casseroles he pretended to eat, Invited him to church services he politely declined, and asked about his health with the persistence of someone who'd buried enough people to recognize the warning signs of a man giving up. The morning Frank spotted the dog in the ice, he'd been driving to the grocery store for his weekly supply of frozen meals and instant coffee, the same route he'd driven for 43 years when Clearwater was his postal delivery territory. He knew every house, every family, every dog that would bark at his truck, but he'd never seen this one before. The German Shepherd weighed close to 90 pounds of dead weight, and Frank's back screamed in protest as he hauled the unconscious animal from the lake. Ice water soaked through his jacket and jeans, but the dog's faint breathing against his chest kept him moving toward his pickup truck. Duke, the name came to him instinctively. Something about the dog's noble bearing, even in unconsciousness, didn't stir during the 20-minute drive to Clearwater Emergency Veterinary Clinic. Dr. Patricia Williams had seen plenty of half-drowned animals in her 15 years of practice, but something about this case made her pause. The German Shepherd's muscle tone suggested extensive training. His coat showed signs of quality breeding, and despite his hypothermic state, he responded to basic commands with the precision of a professional. "Mr. Brennan, this isn't a stray," she said, examining Duke more closely. "Look at his conditioning, his dental care, the way his nails are trimmed. Someone invested serious money in this dog." Frank watched Duke's chest rise and fall under the warming blankets, those intelligent brown eyes now closed but somehow still communicating trust. "No collar? No tags?" "Nothing. We'll scan for a microchip, but—" Dr. Williams hesitated, studying something that made her frown. "There's something else. He has what looks like an old gunshot wound to his left rear leg, and these scars on his flanks. Mr. Brennan, I think this might be a military or police dog." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Military. Like Michael had been before the divorce, before everything fell apart. Like Tommy's father, who'd come back from 2 tours changed in ways that made family dinners feel like navigating a minefield. "The surgery to repair the hip damage will run about $8,000, Dr. Williams continued gently. "The immediate treatment for hypothermia and dehydration is $3,200. I can contact some rescue organizations, set up payment plans." Frank pulled out his credit card, the one Margaret had made him promise to only use for emergencies. Looking at Duke's trusting face, even unconscious, he knew this qualified. Do whatever he needs. The first week of Duke's recovery revealed layers of training that amazed Frank daily. The dog understood hand signals, responded to commands in what sounded like German, and displayed a level of situational awareness that suggested professional experience. But it was the nightmares that broke Frank's heart. Every night, Duke would wake up whimpering, his legs moving as if he were running from something only he could see. Frank would find himself sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, his hand on Duke's flank, whispering the kind of reassurances he'd never been able to give Michael when the nightmares started. "Easy, boy. You're safe now. Whatever happened over there, it's over." Betty Morrison began appearing at Frank's door with increasing frequency, bringing soup and staying to help with Duke's physical therapy exercises. She had a way with the dog that surprised Frank, patient, gentle, but firm enough to command respect. "He's been trained for something serious," she observed, watching Duke navigate the house with military precision despite his healing hip. "The way he checks corners, how he positions himself to watch both the front and back doors. This is a working dog, Frank." "Working at what?" "I don't know, but I think we should find out." The breakthrough came during Duke's second week of recovery. Frank had been sorting through Margaret's things, a task he'd been avoiding for 18 months, when he came across her jewelry box. Inside, beneath her wedding ring and the pearl earrings he'd given her for their 25th anniversary, were the cruise tickets they'd never used. Alaska. the glaciers she'd wanted to see. The grief hit him like a rogue wave, sudden and overwhelming. Frank sank into Margaret's old chair, clutching the tickets, and began to cry, deep, body-shaking sobs that felt like they'd been building pressure for months. Duke appeared at his side instantly, pressing his massive head against Frank's leg with a gentleness that seemed to understand exactly what was needed. The dog didn't try to play or distract, he simply offered his presence, solid and warm and utterly reliable. "She would have loved you," Frank whispered into Duke's fur. "She always said I needed something to take care of besides myself." That night, for the first time since Margaret's death, Frank didn't feel completely alone in the house. Duke slept beside his bed on a pile of old blankets, and Frank found himself listening to the dog's steady breathing instead of the silence that had haunted him for months. But the next morning brought Dr. Williams' phone call, and everything changed. "Frank, I need you to come in. I found something when I was updating Duke's file." Her voice carried a weight that made Frank's stomach clench. "That marking I noticed. It's not just a scar. It's a tattoo, military identification. And I think Duke might not be as abandoned as we thought." The tattoo was barely visible beneath Duke's thick coat, but once Dr. Williams pointed it out, Frank couldn't unsee it. K9 to 247 AFG etched in fading black ink on the inside of Duke's left ear, Afghanistan. The letters seemed to pulse with meaning that made Frank's chest tight with recognition and dread. "I've contacted the Veterans Affairs Office," Dr. Williams explained, her voice careful and measured. "They have records of a German Shepherd with this identification number. Frank, Duke wasn't abandoned. He was retired." "Retired how?" Frank's voice came out rougher than intended. "That's where it gets complicated." Dr. Williams pulled up a file on her computer, her expression troubled. According to their records, K9-247 call sign Rex was scheduled for behavioral termination 6 months ago. The official documentation says he developed severe PTSD after his handler was killed in action and became unsuitable for continued service. The words hit Frank like ice water. "Termination. You mean they were going to put him down, Frank? And according to this, they think they already did." Frank stared at Duke, who was lying peacefully on the examination table, his tail wagging slowly as if he understood he was the center of an important conversation. The idea that someone had written off this magnificent animal, this loyal companion who'd already given everything to his country, made Frank's hands shake with a rage he hadn't felt since Michael's deployment orders came through. "So what does this mean for us?" Dr. Williams hesitated. "It means that legally, Duke belongs to the U.S. military. If they find out he's alive—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Frank understood. They'd come for him. They'd finish what they'd started. "How long do we have?" "I haven't reported this yet. Technically, I should have called the moment I identified the tattoo, but—" She looked at Duke, then back at Frank. "I've seen too many good dogs destroyed because of paperwork and procedures. Give me 24 hours to make some calls, see if there's another way." Frank drove home in silence, Duke sitting in the passenger seat with the dignity of a co-pilot. The dog seemed to sense the shift in mood, his alert eyes scanning the road ahead as if he were back on duty. When they pulled into the driveway, Betty Morrison was waiting on the porch with a casserole dish and a worried expression. "You look like someone died," she said, then immediately winced at her choice of words. "I'm sorry, Frank. What's wrong?" Frank found himself telling her everything. The tattoo, the military records, the threat of Duke being taken away just when Frank had begun to believe in something again. Betty listened with the patience of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching children how to work through problems that seemed insurmountable. "So what are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know. Fight it, I guess, though I'm not sure what good it'll do. I'm just one old man with a pension and a mortgage. You're not alone in this, Frank." Betty's voice carried a certainty that surprised him. Duke has touched something in you that's been sleeping for too long. If they want to take him, they'll have to go through both of us. That evening, Frank made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his laptop, a Christmas gift from Michael that had been gathering dust for 3 years, and began researching everything he could find about military canine retirement policies, PTSD and working dogs, and the rights of veterans to adopt their service animals. What he found made his blood boil. Hundreds of military dogs were euthanized every year, not because they were dangerous or sick, but because they were deemed unsuitable for civilian life after developing trauma responses to their service. Dogs who'd saved countless human lives were being discarded like broken equipment. Duke seemed to sense Frank's distress. The big dog positioned himself at Frank's feet, his warm presence a steady reminder of what was at stake. Every few minutes, Duke would rest his head on Frank's knee, those intelligent eyes offering the kind of unconditional support Frank hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. "You know what they're saying about you, don't you, boy?" Frank whispered, scratching behind Duke's ears. "They think you're broken. They think you can't be saved." Duke's tail thumped against the floor in response. "Well, I've got news for them. Margaret always said broken things just need the right person to see their value." At midnight, Frank's research was interrupted by a phone call from Dr. Williams. Her voice was tense with urgency. "Frank, you need to listen carefully. I spoke with a contact at the VA, and there's something they didn't tell us about Duke's case. His handler, Sergeant Maria Santos, didn't die in action. She was discharged after suffering a traumatic brain injury, and she's been fighting for 2 years to adopt Duke through official channels." Frank felt the world shift beneath him. "She's alive?" "Very much so. And Frank, she's been looking for Duke ever since he disappeared from the transport facility 6 months ago. The military told her he'd been euthanized, but she never believed it. She's been searching veterans' shelters and rescue organizations across 3 states. The implications crashed over Frank like a wave. Duke wasn't just a retired military dog. He was someone's partner, someone's family, someone who was grieving his loss just as deeply as Frank had grieved Margaret's death. "There's more," Dr. Williams continued. "She's driving here tomorrow. She wants to see if it's really him." Frank looked down at Duke, who was watching him with those trusting brown eyes that had become the center of his world. In less than 24 hours, he might lose the only thing that had given his life meaning since Margaret died. But if Duke belonged to someone who loved him as much as Frank did, what right did he have to keep them apart? Frank barely slept that night. Every time he dozed off, he'd wake to find Duke watching him with those alert brown eyes, as if the dog sensed the approaching storm. By dawn, Frank had made coffee 3 times and paced the kitchen enough to wear a path in Margaret's old linoleum. The thought of losing Duke felt like losing Margaret all over again, that same helpless watching as something precious slipped away beyond his control. Betty arrived at 8 in the morning with fresh muffins and the determined expression of someone ready for battle. "How are you holding up?" "Like a man about to lose his best friend to a stranger," Frank said, accepting the coffee she poured without asking. "What if she takes one look at him and that's it? What if he remembers her and forgets all about me?" "Frank Brennan, you listen to me." Betty's voice carried the authority of 4 decades in the classroom. "Love doesn't work that way. It's not like a pie where each person gets a smaller slice when someone new comes along. It's more like a candle lighting another candle. There's more light, not less." At 10:30, a dusty Honda Civic pulled into Frank's driveway. The woman who emerged was small and wiry, with short black hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from military training. Her left hand showed the telltale tremor of nerve damage, and she walked with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. But her eyes, dark and determined, held the same desperate hope Frank had been carrying for weeks. Duke's reaction was instantaneous and heartbreaking. The big dog launched himself toward the front door with a whine Frank had never heard before, his whole body vibrating with recognition and joy. But what destroyed Frank was what happened next. Duke turned back to him, whining softly, as if trying to bridge two worlds that suddenly seemed impossible to reconcile. "Rex?" Sergeant Maria Santos whispered, dropping to her knees as Duke bounded toward her. "Oh God, Rex, I thought you were dead." The reunion was everything Frank had feared and more. Duke covered Maria's face with kisses, his tail a blur of motion, making sounds of pure joy that Frank had never heard from him. But every few seconds, the dog would look back at Frank, his expression confused and torn, as if asking for permission to be happy. "I've been looking for you for 6 months," Maria said through tears, her hands running over Duke's fur as if confirming he was real. "When they told me you'd been euthanized, I didn't believe them. I knew you were too stubborn to die." Frank stood in his doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own life. Betty's hand found his arm, steadying him as he watched the reunion he'd known was inevitable, but had hoped would never come. "Mr. Brennan?" Maria looked up at him, her eyes bright with gratitude and something that might have been guilt. "Dr. Williams told me what you've done for Rex. The surgery, the recovery. I can never repay you for saving his life." "His name is Duke now," Frank said quietly, then immediately felt foolish for the possessiveness in his voice. Maria's expression softened. "Duke, I like that. It suits him." She stood slowly, Duke pressed against her leg but his eyes still tracking Frank's movements. "Mr. Brennan, can we talk? I think there's a lot we need to discuss." They sat in Frank's living room, Duke positioning himself exactly between them as if he couldn't choose sides. Maria's story unfolded in pieces. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Rex as her partner for the last 2 years, the IED explosion that ended both their military careers. "Rex saved my life that day," she said, unconsciously touching the scar on her forehead. "Pushed me down just before the blast. The shrapnel that should have killed me hit him instead." She looked at Duke with the kind of love Frank recognized from his own heart. "They wanted to retire him because of the leg injury, but also because they said he'd developed behavioral issues after I was evacuated." "What kind of issues?" "Separation anxiety. He wouldn't work with other handlers, wouldn't eat when I wasn't there. They said he was emotionally compromised." Maria's voice turned bitter, as if loving someone was a character flaw. Frank understood that feeling. After Margaret died, he'd been told he needed to move on, to get back out there, as if grief were a temporary inconvenience rather than the price of having loved someone completely. "I fought the discharge for 2 years," Maria continued. "Tried to adopt him through official channels, but the paperwork, there was always another form, another evaluation, another excuse. And then 6 months ago they said he'd been euthanized. I knew they were lying, but I couldn't prove it. So you've been searching. Every shelter, every rescue organization, every veterinary clinic within 500 miles. I posted his picture on every military dog rescue website I could find." She pulled out her phone, showing Frank a photo of Duke in military gear, alert and proud beside a smiling Maria. This was taken 2 weeks before the bombing. Frank stared at the photo, seeing Duke as he'd been, a professional, a soldier, part of a team that had depended on each other for survival. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, and it made Frank's rescue seem small and accidental by comparison. "Mr. Brennan," Maria said carefully, "I know you've grown attached to Rex, to Duke, and I can see that he cares about you too, but I need you to understand he's not just my dog, he's my partner. He's the only family I have left." The words hit Frank like a physical blow because he understood them so completely. Duke wasn't just his dog either. He was Frank's reason for getting up in the morning, his reminder that he still had something to offer the world, his bridge back to caring about anything at all. "I know," Frank said quietly, "and I need you to understand that for the past month, he's been the only thing standing between me and, well, let's just say he saved my life too." They sat in silence for a long moment, Duke's presence between them like a question that needed answering. Finally, Maria spoke. "There's something else you should know. The reason Rex disappeared from the transport facility, I think he was trying to find me. The place where you found him, Clearwater Lake. It's only about 40 miles from the VA hospital where I was getting treatment. I think he's been looking for me all this time." Frank felt something crack inside his chest. The idea that Duke had been searching, suffering, trying to get back to the person he loved most made Frank's rescue seem less like salvation and more like interference. "So what happens now?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "I don't know," Maria admitted. "I came here expecting to just take him home. But seeing him with you, seeing how comfortable he is here, how healthy he looks—" She trailed off, watching Duke's head swivel between them like he was following a tennis match. "He's bonded with you, hasn't he?" Yeah, he has." Betty, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen doorway, finally spoke up. "What if there was another way?" Both Frank and Maria turned to look at her. "I mean, you're both veterans, right? You've both lost people you love. You both understand what this dog means." Betty moved into the living room, settling into Margaret's old chair with the confidence of someone who had a plan. "What if instead of one of you losing him, you both got to keep him?" "What do you mean?" Maria asked. "I mean, what's stopping you from moving here, from being neighbors, from sharing custody like a divorced couple who actually likes each other?" Frank stared at Betty, his mind racing. The idea was crazy, impossible, perfect. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Maria admitted quietly. "The VA found me an apartment in Columbus, but it's temporary housing, and honestly, I've been so focused on finding Rex that I haven't thought much about what comes after." "There's a small house for rent 2 streets over," Betty continued, as if she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. "Mrs. Patterson's place. She moved to assisted living last month. It's nothing fancy, but it has a yard, and it's close enough that Duke could visit both his families." Frank looked at Duke, who was now lying with his head on Maria's feet and his body stretched toward Frank, as if he'd figured out the solution before any of them. "You'd be okay with that?" Frank asked Maria. "Sharing him? Would you?" Frank thought about the alternative, going back to his empty house, his silent mornings, his slow countdown to nothing. Then he thought about Duke's joy at seeing Maria, the completeness he'd witnessed in their reunion. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I would." 3 weeks into their unconventional arrangement, Frank thought he'd found a rhythm that could work. Maria had moved into Mrs. Patterson's rental house, and Duke split his time between both homes with the diplomatic grace of a seasoned negotiator. Mornings were Frank's, coffee on the porch, walks around the lake, the comfortable silence of 2 old souls who understood each other. Evenings belonged to Maria, training exercises, grooming sessions, and the kind of intense bonding that came from shared combat experience. But the call that shattered their careful peace came on a Tuesday morning while Frank was teaching Duke to fetch the newspaper, a trick that had taken 3 weeks to master and filled Frank with ridiculous pride. "Mr. Brennan, this is Colonel James Richardson from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I understand you're currently housing a military working dog that was reported deceased 6 months ago." Frank's blood turned to ice. Duke seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, abandoning the newspaper to press against Frank's leg with protective intensity. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," Frank said carefully. "K9 to 247. Call sign Rex. We have reports that he's been identified and is currently in your custody. Mr. Brennan, that animal is government property, and harboring him constitutes theft of military assets." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Military assets. As if Duke were a piece of equipment rather than a living being who dreamed at night and knew the difference between Frank's happy voice and his worried one. "Now, I understand you've grown attached to the animal," Colonel Richardson continued, his tone suggesting he understood nothing at all. "But this situation needs to be resolved immediately. We're prepared to offer you compensation for veterinary expenses and a commendation for your service to military personnel." "And what happens to Duke?" Frank asked, though he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "The dog will be returned to military custody for proper evaluation and processing." Processing. Mr. Brennan, K9-247, was scheduled for behavioral termination due to severe PTSD and inability to adapt to civilian life. That assessment hasn't changed. The animal poses a potential risk to public safety. Frank looked down at Duke, who was lying peacefully at his feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the porch boards when a bird landed nearby. The idea that this gentle, intelligent creature posed a risk to anyone made Frank's hands shake with fury. "You have 48 hours to surrender the animal voluntarily, or we'll be forced to involve local law enforcement." The line went dead, leaving Frank staring at his phone in disbelief. Duke looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes, and Frank felt something crack inside his chest. Not grief this time, but rage so pure it surprised him with its intensity. He called Maria immediately. She arrived within minutes, her face pale with a fury that matched his own. "They found us," Frank said simply. "How?" "Does it matter? They want him back. They want to finish what they started." Maria sank into Margaret's old porch chair, Duke immediately moving to comfort her with the same intuitive grace he'd shown Frank in his darkest moments. "We can't let them take him. Frank, you don't understand what they'll do to him. It won't be quick or kind. They'll run tests, evaluations, justify their decision with paperwork and protocols, and then—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Frank understood. They'd put Duke down like a broken machine, and they'd do it with the clean conscience that came from following regulations. "Then we fight them," Frank said. "With what?" "I'm a disabled veteran with a traumatic brain injury and an honorable discharge. You're a retired postal worker. They have lawyers, Frank. They have the law on their side." "Then we get lawyers, too." "With what money? Do you know what legal representation costs? Even if we could afford it, military law is different. They own him, Frank. According to every piece of paper that matters, Duke is government property." Frank felt the walls closing in, the same helpless frustration he'd experienced watching Margaret waste away in a hospital bed while doctors spoke in careful euphemisms about comfort care and quality of life. The difference was that Margaret had been dying regardless of what anyone did. Duke was perfectly healthy, perfectly happy, and they wanted to kill him anyway. "There has to be something," Frank insisted. "Some regulation, some loophole, some way to prove he's not dangerous." "Frank!" Betty's voice came from the driveway where she stood holding a manila envelope with the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. "This was just delivered to your door. Certified mail." Frank opened the envelope with hands that shook despite his efforts to stay calm. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the meaning was clear. Frank had 48 hours to surrender Duke or face federal charges for theft of government property. The penalties included up to 5 years in prison and fines that would cost him his house, his savings, and any hope of a comfortable retirement. "They're serious," Maria said, reading over his shoulder. "Frank, if you fight this and lose, You could lose everything." "I already lost everything," Frank replied quietly. "Margaret, Michael, Tommy. I've been losing pieces of myself for years. Duke is the first thing I've found worth fighting for." "And if you go to prison, what happens to him then?" Frank had no answer for that. He looked down at Duke, who was watching them with the kind of intelligent concern that suggested he understood more than any dog should have to. The idea of spending his final years in prison while Duke was euthanized anyway made Frank feel sick. "There might be another way," Betty said slowly. "It's crazy and it might not work, but tell me." "Media attention, public pressure. Make this a story about a war hero being euthanized by bureaucrats, and suddenly those regulations don't look so reasonable." Maria shook her head. "The military doesn't respond to public pressure the way civilian organizations do. If anything, media attention might make them more determined to follow protocol." "Not military media," Betty said. "Human interest media. Local news, social media, the kind of story that makes people angry enough to call their representatives." Frank felt a spark of something that might have been hope. "You think it could work?" "I think it's worth trying." "What's the worst that could happen?" "They throw me in prison and kill Duke anyway." "And if we do nothing?" Frank looked at Duke, who had moved to the porch railing and was watching the lake with the alert posture of a sentry on duty. Even now, even facing an uncertain future, Duke was ready to protect the people he loved. "Okay," Frank said. "Let's try." The next 24 hours became a whirlwind of phone calls, interviews, and social media posts that Frank barely understood but Betty orchestrated with the efficiency of a military campaign. The story hit the local news first. Elderly veteran fights to save military dog from euthanasia, then spread to regional outlets, veterans advocacy groups, and animal rights organizations. Frank's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews, veterans groups offered legal support, and animal lovers from across the country shared their outrage on Facebook pages Frank had never heard of. Duke, oblivious to his newfound fame, continued his routine of morning walks and evening training sessions as if nothing had changed. But the attention came with a price. Colonel Richardson called Frank personally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Brennan, your media campaign is making this situation unnecessarily complicated. The Army doesn't negotiate policy based on public sentiment." "Then maybe the Army's policy needs to change," Frank replied, surprised by his own boldness. "Canine 247 is a dangerous animal with documented behavioral issues. Your emotional attachment to him doesn't change the facts. The only fact I see is a dog who's been nothing but gentle and loyal for the past 2 months. If he's dangerous, Colonel, then I'm the Easter Bunny." "Mr. Brennan, you have 18 hours to comply with the surrender order. After that, we'll have no choice but to involve federal marshals." The line went dead, leaving Frank staring at his phone with the sick realization that their media campaign might have made things worse instead of better. Duke looked up at him from his spot by the door, tail wagging hopefully, and Frank felt his heart break all over again. That evening, as Frank and Maria sat on the porch watching Duke chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Betty arrived with news that changed everything. "I just got off the phone with a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch," she said, settling into her usual chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just won a battle. "They've been investigating military canine retirement policies, and they found something interesting." "What kind of something?" "The kind that might save Duke's life. It turns out Colonel Richardson has been falsifying retirement records for military dogs. And in the past 2 years, at least 15 dogs that were supposed to be adopted by their handlers have been euthanized instead, and the paperwork was altered to make it look like they were too dangerous for civilian life." Frank felt the world shift beneath him. "They can prove this?" "They have documentation, Frank. Internal memos, falsified medical records, testimony from other veterans who've been fighting for their dogs. The story's going to run tomorrow morning, and the reporter says the Pentagon is already launching an investigation. Maria was staring at Betty with an expression Frank couldn't read. You're saying this isn't just about Duke? I'm saying Duke is just the tip of the iceberg. And sometimes, Frank, the best way to save one life is to expose the system that's threatening it. Frank looked at Duke, who had given up chasing fireflies and was now lying contentedly at Frank's feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog had no idea that his life hung in the balance, that his fate was being decided by people in offices hundreds of miles away who'd never met him, never seen the gentle way he comforted someone who was grieving, never witnessed the intelligence and loyalty that made him more than just government property. "So what happens now?" Frank asked. "Now we wait," Betty said. "And we hope that sometimes, when you shine enough light on darkness, people remember how to do the right thing." The countdown clock in Frank's head showed 17 hours and 32 minutes until the federal marshals arrived. Duke slept peacefully beside his chair, unaware that his tomorrow hung in the balance of a newspaper story and the conscience of strangers who'd never met him. But for the first time since Colonel Richardson's phone call, Frank allowed himself to hope that love might be stronger than regulation, that truth might matter more than procedure, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change everything. The Columbus Dispatch story broke at 6 in the morning, and by 7:30 Frank's phone was ringing with calls from reporters, veterans advocates, and complete strangers offering support. But the call that mattered came at 8:15, and it wasn't the one Frank had been expecting. "Mr. Brennan, this is Deputy Marshal Sarah Chen. I'm calling to inform you that the federal warrant for K-9247's seizure has been temporarily suspended pending an internal Pentagon investigation." Frank nearly dropped the phone. Duke, sensing his excitement, lifted his head from his morning nap with alert interest. "Suspended? For how long?" "I can't give you specifics, sir, but I'd recommend you enjoy the reprieve while it lasts. These investigations can take weeks or months, but they can also be concluded very quickly if the evidence isn't as solid as it appears." Frank thanked her and immediately called Maria, who arrived within minutes, her face showing the same cautious hope Frank felt. And they sat on the porch reading the newspaper article together, Duke lying between them as if he sensed the importance of the moment. The story was damning. Colonel Richardson and 2 other officers had systematically falsified records for military working dogs, claiming behavioral issues that didn't exist to justify euthanasia rather than the expensive process of civilian retirement. The article included testimony from 12 veterans who'd been told their dogs were too dangerous for adoption, only to later discover through leaked documents that their partners had been perfectly healthy. "Listen to this," Maria read aloud. "Internal Army emails obtained by the Dispatch show that the cost of proper psychological evaluation and civilian placement for retired military dogs was deemed prohibitively expensive by the K-9 Retirement Division. Instead, dogs were being euthanized and their deaths attributed to behavioral issues that, in many cases, were never properly documented or even observed." Frank felt sick reading the statistics. Hundreds of military dogs, heroes who'd served their country with the same dedication as their human counterparts, had been killed to save money on paperwork and proper retirement procedures. "Duke could have been just another number," Maria said quietly, scratching behind his ears. "If you hadn't found him, if you hadn't fought for him." "But I did," Frank said firmly. "We did. And now maybe we can help save some of the others too." The temporary reprieve felt like a gift, but Frank knew better than to relax completely. Government investigations could change direction quickly, and Colonel Richardson still had the law on his side if he could prove Duke was genuinely dangerous. So Frank and Maria decided to spend the time documenting everything that proved Duke's stability and gentle nature. They filmed him interacting with children at the local park, recorded his calm responses to loud noises and stressful situations, and gathered testimonials from Dr. Williams, Betty, and other neighbors who'd witnessed Duke's behavior over the past 2 months. Maria put her military training to work, creating a comprehensive behavioral assessment that would have impressed any Pentagon official. But it was during one of these documentation sessions that everything went wrong. Frank was filming Duke's response to commands when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's number, the first time his son had called in over a year. "Dad, I just saw the news story about you and some military dog. What the hell is going on?" Frank felt his chest tighten at the familiar tone of disapproval in Michael's voice. "Hello to you too, Michael. Don't hello me." "Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? Federal charges, Dad? At your age? Have you completely lost your mind?" The words hit Frank like a slap. After months of feeling useful again, of having something important to fight for, Michael's reaction reminded him why they'd grown apart in the first place. "I'm trying to save a life, Michael. Something I should have done more of when you needed me." "This isn't about me, Dad. This is about you making reckless decisions that could land you in federal prison. I've been talking to a lawyer, and if you're declared mentally incompetent, I can have you placed in assisted living where you can't hurt yourself with these ridiculous crusades." Frank felt the world tilt beneath him. "You're threatening to have me committed?" "I'm trying to protect you from yourself. This dog obsession isn't healthy, Dad." "You're 70 years old, living alone, spending your life savings on a stray animal while ignoring your real family." "Real family?" Frank's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "When was the last time you called, Michael? When was the last time you brought Tommy to visit? When was the last time you acted like you cared whether I lived or died?" "I'm calling now." "You're calling because you saw me on the news and you're embarrassed. You're not calling because you give a damn about my happiness." The argument escalated quickly, both men saying things they'd been holding back for years. Michael accused Frank of choosing a dog over his own family. Frank accused Michael of only caring about him when it was convenient or potentially embarrassing. The conversation ended with Michael hanging up after threatening to petition for guardianship if Frank didn't come to his senses. Frank stood in his living room, shaking with rage and heartbreak, while Duke pressed against his legs with the kind of unwavering support Michael had never offered. The irony wasn't lost on him. A dog he'd known for 2 months understood his needs better than the son he'd raised for 18 years. Maria, who'd witnessed the entire conversation, looked stricken. "Frank, he can't really do that, can he? Have you declared incompetent?" "If he gets the right doctors, the right lawyers—" Frank sank into Margaret's chair, feeling every one of his 70 years. "Michael's always been good at making me feel like my decisions are wrong. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am losing my mind." "Stop that!" Betty's voice came from the doorway, where she stood with the fierce expression of someone ready to fight. "I've been watching you for 2 months, Frank Brennan, and you're the sanest you've been since Margaret died. Don't let your son's fear make you doubt yourself." "He's not wrong about the risks, Betty. If I lose this fight, I could lose everything. And if you don't fight, what do you have left anyway? A quiet house, a lonely retirement, and the knowledge that you gave up when something finally mattered to you again?" Frank looked at Duke, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that had become the center of his world. The dog had already survived abandonment, injury, and a death sentence. He deserved better than to be sacrificed to Frank's family drama. "There's something else," Maria said quietly. "I didn't want to tell you while you were dealing with the federal investigation, but I've been having seizures, side effects from the brain injury. They're getting worse." Frank felt his heart stop. "What does that mean?" "It means I might not be able to take care of Duke much longer. The doctors are talking about supervised living arrangements, maybe even long-term care if the seizures don't stabilize." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at Duke. I've been so focused on fighting for him that I haven't wanted to admit I might not be able to give him the life he deserves." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own fears and uncertainties. Duke seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, moving between them to offer comfort with the instinctive grace that had made him such an effective therapy companion. "So, what do we do?" Frank asked finally. "We fight," Betty said firmly. "All of us, together. We fight the Pentagon, we fight Michael's lawyers, and we fight whatever comes next. Because sometimes, Frank, the only way to honor the people we've loved and lost is to fight like hell for the people we love now." Frank looked around at the small group gathered in his living room. A disabled veteran facing an uncertain medical future, a retired teacher with more courage than common sense, and a dog who'd already survived more than any living creature should have to endure. They weren't much of an army, but they were his army. "Okay," Frank said, feeling something settle into place in his chest. "Let's fight." But even as he spoke the words, Frank could hear the countdown clock in his head ticking toward an uncertain future. The Pentagon investigation could end at any moment. Michael's legal threats were real and immediate, and Maria's health was deteriorating faster than any of them wanted to admit. Duke laid his head on Frank's knee, and Frank realized that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on. It's being willing to risk everything to protect what matters most, even when the odds are impossible and the cost might be everything you have left. The call that changed everything came at 3 in the morning on a Thursday, 6 days after Michael's threats and 4 days after Maria's seizure revelation. Frank was jolted awake by his phone's insistent ringing, Duke immediately alert beside the bed, sensing trouble in the way dogs always do. "Frank, it's Betty. You need to come to the hospital, now." Frank's blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "It's Maria. She had a massive seizure at home. The paramedics—" "Frank, it's bad. Really bad." The drive to Clearwater General felt like the longest 20 minutes of Frank's life. Duke sat in the passenger seat, uncharacteristically still, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Frank's hands shook on the steering wheel as he thought about Maria lying unconscious in a hospital bed, about Duke losing another partner, about how quickly everything good in his life seemed to slip away. Doctor. Jennifer Walsh met them in the emergency waiting room with the kind of careful expression that doctors wear when they're about to deliver devastating news. "Mr. Brennan, I understand you're Ms. Santos's emergency contact." Frank nodded, though he couldn't remember when that had happened. Somewhere in the past 2 months, he and Maria had become family in the way that trauma and shared purpose create bonds stronger than blood. Maria suffered what we call a grand mal seizure, likely caused by increased pressure on her brain from scar tissue related to her military injury. She's stable now, but... Dr. Walsh paused, glancing at Duke, who was sitting at perfect attention beside Frank's chair. "The damage is significant. Even if she recovers consciousness, which isn't guaranteed, she'll likely need full-time care for the foreseeable future." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Maria, who'd been fighting to save Duke, fighting to build a new life, fighting to prove that wounded veterans deserved better than being discarded like broken equipment, was now facing the same kind of bureaucratic abandonment she'd been trying to prevent. "Can I see her?" "Of course. But Mr. Brennan, there's something else. Ms. Santos had prepared some legal documents that she asked me to give you if anything happened to her." Dr. Walsh handed him a manila envelope. "She said you'd understand." Frank opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a notarized letter transferring all rights and responsibilities for Duke's care to Frank, along with a detailed medical history and a personal note in Maria's careful handwriting. "Frank, if you're reading this, then my brain finally gave up the fight. My heart wasn't ready to quit. Duke belongs with you now, completely and legally. You saved his life, but more than that, you gave him a home where he's loved for who he is, not what he can do. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? Don't let them take him. Don't let my sacrifice be for nothing. Love him enough for both of us. Maria. Frank read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Duke was his now, legally and completely. But the victory felt hollow when the price was Maria's life hanging in the balance. "She's been planning this for weeks," Betty said quietly, reading over his shoulder. She knew her condition was getting worse, and she wanted to make sure Duke would be protected no matter what happened to her. Frank looked down at Duke, who was pressing close against his legs with the kind of desperate affection that suggested he understood more than he should. The dog had already lost one partner to violence and injury. Now he was facing the possibility of losing another. "What do we do now?" Frank asked. Before Betty could answer, Frank's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was achingly familiar. "Grandpa Frank?" Frank's heart stopped. "Tommy? I saw the news story about you and Duke. Mom showed me the video online." The 12-year-old's voice was tentative, unsure. "I wanted to call, but Dad said, he said you probably didn't want to hear from us." Frank felt tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. "Tommy, I've wanted to hear from you every day for 3 years." "Really? Because Dad said you told him you were too old to deal with kids anymore." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He remembered that conversation differently, remembered being exhausted from Margaret's care, overwhelmed by grief, terrified of failing another person he loved. But he could see how his refusal to take Tommy for the summer had been interpreted as rejection rather than fear. "Tommy, listen to me very carefully," Frank said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I have never, not for one single day, stopped wanting you in my life. I made mistakes, big ones, but not wanting to be your grandfather wasn't one of them." There was silence on the other end of the line, then the sound of muffled crying. "Tommy, are you okay? I thought you hated me. I thought that's why you never called, why you didn't want to see me when Dad and Mom got divorced." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of 3 years of misunderstanding and pride-driven silence. "I could never hate you, buddy. You're the best part of this family, and I'm sorry I let you think otherwise. Can I come see you? And Duke? I've been reading about military dogs online, and I think what you're doing is really cool." Frank looked at Betty, who was nodding encouragingly, then at Duke, who seemed to sense the importance of the conversation. "Tommy, I would love nothing more than to have you visit. But there's something you need to know. Your dad is trying to have me declared mentally incompetent because of my fight to keep Duke. If you come here, it might make things harder for all of us." "That's stupid. You're not crazy, Grandpa Frank. You're just doing what's right." Out of the mouths of babes, Frank thought. Sometimes it took a 12-year-old to cut through adult complications and see the simple truth. "Where are you calling from?" "Mom's house. She's here, and she wants to talk to you." The phone was passed, and suddenly Frank was talking to his daughter-in-law, Jennifer, for the first time since the divorce. "Frank, I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I've been letting Michael control the narrative about why you and Tommy don't have a relationship, and I shouldn't have. That boy has been heartbroken thinking you don't want him. Jennifer, let me finish. I've been following your story in the news, and I want you to know that if Michael tries to have you declared incompetent, Tommy and I will testify on your behalf. What you're doing for this dog, the way you've brought people together to fight for what's right, that's not the behavior of someone who's lost his mental faculties. That's the behavior of someone who's found his purpose." Frank felt something break open in his chest, not the painful crack of loss, but the expansive warmth of unexpected support. "Thank you, Jennifer. That means more than you know. Frank, there's something else. Tommy's been asking to spend the summer with you for 3 years. Michael keeps saying you're not interested, but would you be interested, I mean? Frank looked around the hospital waiting room, at Betty, who'd become his anchor, at Duke, who'd become his purpose, at the uncertain future that somehow felt more hopeful than it had in years. Jennifer, having Tommy here for the summer would be the best thing that's happened to me since Margaret died. Then consider it done. Michael doesn't get to make that decision for Tommy anymore. After they hung up, Frank sat in stunned silence. In the span of one devastating phone call about Maria, he'd also gained back the family he thought he'd lost forever. "Well," Betty said with a smile that didn't quite hide her tears, "it sounds like our little army just got reinforcements." But even as Frank felt his heart expanding to accommodate this new hope, he knew the battles ahead were far from over. Maria lay unconscious upstairs, her future uncertain. The Pentagon investigation could conclude at any moment, possibly not in their favor. Michael's legal threats were still real and immediate. And now Tommy would be arriving in 6 weeks, expecting to find a grandfather who had his life together, not one who might be facing federal charges or a competency hearing. Duke seemed to sense Frank's swirling emotions. The big dog moved closer, resting his head on Frank's knee with the kind of unwavering loyalty that had started this whole journey. "You know what, boy?" Frank said softly, scratching behind Duke's ears. "Maybe Maria was right. Maybe sometimes the fight is worth it, even when you don't know how it's going to end." As if in response, Duke's tail thumped once against the hospital floor, a small gesture of agreement that somehow made Frank believe that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The countdown clock in Frank's head had stopped ticking toward an ending and started counting toward a beginning. Tommy would arrive in 6 weeks. The Pentagon investigation would conclude eventually. Maria would either recover or she wouldn't. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Frank felt like he was building something instead of just trying to hold on to the pieces of what he'd lost. Duke stretched out beside Frank's chair, maintaining contact with his leg while positioning himself to watch the hospital corridors with alert, protective eyes. Even here, even in the midst of uncertainty and fear, the dog was ready to defend his family. And family, Frank realized, was exactly what they'd become. 2 months later, Frank stood in his kitchen watching Tommy teach Duke to balance a treat on his nose, and for the first time in 3 years, his house felt like a home again. The 12-year-old had arrived for summer vacation with a duffel bag, a stack of library books about military dogs, and an enthusiasm that had transformed Frank's quiet routine into something resembling organized chaos. "Grandpa Frank, watch this!" Tommy called out, holding up his hand in a stop gesture. Duke sat at perfect attention, a dog biscuit balanced on his snout, his eyes focused on Tommy with the kind of intense concentration that spoke to his military training. "Wait for it. Wait for it. Okay." Duke tossed his head back, caught the treat mid-air, and wagged his tail with satisfaction while Tommy cheered. Frank found himself grinning in a way that felt rusty from disuse but wonderfully familiar. "That's impressive, buddy. How long did it take you to teach him that?" 3 days. Betty helped. And she says Duke is the smartest dog she's ever met, and she used to have a classroom full of kids to compare him to. The mention of Betty made Frank smile even wider. His neighbor had become such a constant presence in their lives that Tommy had started setting 4 places at the dinner table without being asked. The relationship that had grown between Frank and Betty felt like the best kind of surprise, unexpected but natural, built on shared purpose rather than loneliness. Speaking of Betty, she should be here soon with the news about Maria. Tommy's expression grew serious in the way that showed he understood more about adult complications than a 12-year-old should have to. "Is she going to be okay?" "I don't know, son. The doctors say she's been showing more responsiveness this week, but brain injuries are complicated." The truth was more hopeful than Frank had dared to admit out loud. Maria had woken up 4 days ago, confused and weak but undeniably present. Her speech was slurred and her memory patchy, but when Frank had brought Duke to visit, she'd cried tears of joy and managed to whisper, "Good boy," when Duke gently licked her hand. Will she be able to come home soon? Eventually, maybe. But even if she does, she's going to need a lot of help for a long time. Tommy was quiet for a moment, scratching Duke behind the ears with the kind of careful attention he gave to important problems. "Grandpa Frank, what if she came to live here? I mean, when I go back to Mom's house for school, there's going to be an extra bedroom and Betty's here all the time anyway." Frank stared at his grandson, amazed by the generosity of spirit that made such complicated solutions seem simple. "That's very thoughtful, Tommy, but taking care of someone with a brain injury is a big responsibility. So was saving Duke. But you did that. And Betty used to take care of kids with special needs in her classroom, remember? She told me about it when we were training Duke yesterday." Before Frank could respond, Betty's car pulled into the driveway, and she emerged with the kind of smile that suggested good news. Duke immediately bounded to greet her, his tail a blur of motion that never failed to make Frank think of a helicopter taking off. "Well?" Frank asked as she climbed the porch steps with Duke dancing around her feet. "The Pentagon investigation concluded this morning," Betty announced, settling into her usual chair with the satisfaction of someone delivering long-awaited news. "Colonel Richardson and his associates have been relieved of duty pending criminal charges. The entire K-9 retirement program is being overhauled, and Duke's case is being used as an example of proper civilian placement procedures." Frank felt his knees go weak with relief. So he's safe? Officially? More than safe. The Army is issuing a formal apology and providing a pension for Duke's ongoing care. Plus, they want to feature his story in their new adoption program for retired military dogs. Tommy whooped with joy, throwing his arms around Duke in a hug that the big dog tolerated with patient dignity. "Did you hear that, boy? You're famous." "There's more," Betty continued, her smile growing even wider. "Maria's doctor called an hour ago. She's being discharged to a rehabilitation facility next week, and her cognitive function tests are showing remarkable improvement. She specifically asked if Duke could visit during her therapy sessions." Frank felt tears threatening and didn't bother to hide them. After months of fighting, of uncertainty, of feeling like he was one phone call away from losing everything that mattered, the idea that they'd all made it through felt almost too good to believe. "And there's one more thing," Betty said, reaching into her purse for an envelope that looked suspiciously official. "This came in today's mail." Frank opened the envelope to find a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs offering him a position as a volunteer coordinator for their new military dog adoption program. The salary wasn't much, but it would supplement his pension and give him a chance to help other veterans navigate the process he'd just survived. "They want me to help other people adopt their military dogs? Apparently, your case has become something of a legend in veterans advocacy circles. They figure if you can take on the Pentagon and win, you might be able to help other people do the same thing." Frank looked around his porch at the family that had assembled itself through crisis and determination. Tommy feeding Duke another treat, Betty organizing papers with the efficiency that had made her a legendary teacher, Duke maintaining his alert watch over all of them, even while enjoying the attention. "What about Michael?" Frank asked, remembering the legal threats that had loomed so large just weeks ago. "Funny thing about that," Betty said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "When your son heard about the Pentagon investigation results and saw Tommy's interview with the local news station, he suddenly decided that maybe his father wasn't quite as incompetent as he'd thought." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Tommy did an interview?" "I may have mentioned to a reporter that Duke's biggest supporter was a 12-year-old boy who'd been separated from his grandfather for 3 years because of family misunderstandings," Betty admitted. And Tommy may have been very articulate about how smart and kind his grandfather is and how Duke brought them back together. Grandpa Frank cried when he saw it, Tommy added helpfully. Happy crying, though. Frank felt his chest tighten with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. The idea that his grandson had defended him publicly, had chosen to associate himself with Frank's fight despite the potential social complications, meant more than any legal victory. So, Michael's backing down? Michael called this morning to congratulate you and ask if Tommy could spend the rest of the summer here instead of just the original 6 weeks. Frank looked at Tommy, who was trying to look nonchalant while clearly holding his breath for the answer. What do you think, buddy? Can you stand being stuck with your old grandpa for another month? Are you kidding? This is the best summer ever. Duke and I have been working on an agility course in the backyard, and Betty's teaching me how to cook your favorite foods. And Maria said when she gets better, she'll teach me some of the commands Duke learned in the army. Frank felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. For 3 years, he'd been counting down to nothing, marking time until his own ending. Now he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, to watching Tommy grow up, to helping other veterans find their way back to their military partners, to building a life that honored the past while embracing the future. Duke seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment. The big dog moved to Frank's side, pressing against his leg with the kind of steady presence that had anchored Frank through the darkest months of his life. "You know what, boy?" Frank said softly, scratching behind Duke's ears. Maria was right. Sometimes the price you think you're paying turns out to be the gift you never knew you needed. That evening, as Frank watched Tommy and Betty work together to prepare dinner while Duke supervised from his favorite spot by the kitchen door, he thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, isolated, grieving, convinced his useful life was over. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been complete. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Jennifer's number, and when he answered, Tommy's mother's voice was warm with gratitude. "Frank, I just wanted to thank you. Tommy called me this afternoon, and I haven't heard him this happy since before the divorce. Whatever you're doing there, it's working." "I'm not doing anything special, Jennifer. Just trying to be the grandfather I should have been all along." "Well, keep it up. And Frank, when school starts, would you be interested in weekend visits? I think Tommy's going to have a hard time being away from you and Duke after this summer." Frank looked around his kitchen, now filled with the sounds of family life he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Jennifer, nothing would make me happier." As he hung up the phone, Frank realized that somewhere in the process of saving Duke, he'd saved himself. And more than that, he'd learned that love didn't diminish when you shared it. It multiplied, creating connections and possibilities he'd never imagined. Duke's tail thumped against the floor in approval, and Frank smiled, knowing that the best chapters of his story were still being written. Frank Brennan's story reminds us that it's never too late to discover that our most meaningful chapters haven't been written yet. At 68, when Frank pulled that half-dead German shepherd from the icy lake, he thought he was saving a dog's life. What he didn't know was that Duke would save his life in return, reconnecting him with his grandson Tommy, bringing love back into his heart through Betty, and giving him a purpose that transformed his lonely retirement into the most fulfilling years of his life. Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as burdens, and what feels like the end of our story is actually just the beginning of our most important chapter. Frank's journey from isolation to becoming a grandfather, husband, and advocate for military dogs proves that love doesn't diminish when we share it. It multiplies, creating connections we never imagined possible. In a world that often discards what it considers too old or no longer useful, Frank and Duke's bond shows us that loyalty, courage, and the willingness to fight for what matters can change everything. Their story is a testament to the truth that age brings wisdom, not irrelevance, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can reshape our entire world. What moment in your life seemed like an ending, but turned out to be a new beginning? Have you ever found unexpected family or purpose in your later years?